Welcome back, AP. I know you love that intro. I know, like, all you were dorking out, probably being like, oh, is this going to be Mr. Cherry playing Minecraft? Well, I know at least Grace Scheck-Snyder and Angelina Murphy were very excited by it. But still, we got to get into what we left off talking about in class, which is the Industrial Revolution, right? We left off discussing how railroads are going to affect everything, right? We discussed that the railroads are going to lead to a growth of business. It's going to lead to a continued downfall of the cottage putting out system, right, which is very, very good, and a bigger growth of the urban working class. Now, railroads are phenomenally important because they were used to actually move product quicker, right? Lay down rails instead of regular roads. Use a horse, let's replace it with a locomotive. George Stephenson's The Rocket, right? So make sure you go ahead and highlight that. It's very, very important. We also discussed how this is going to increase the demand for iron, right? Lauren Gross so aptly brought it up in class today, discussing and wondering, like, oh, well, are they going to run out of iron? Well, Lauren Gross had actually even increased the demand for iron, right? And since it increased the demand for iron, a little note we should make real fast, go ahead and jot this down. Cities, actually majorly populated cities, are going to be constructed with railroad lines around coal and iron deposits, right? So I can actually, like, pull this up really quick for you. Looking up this little picture so you can see about railroads. Now if I can find it. I hate this textbook, but it's really good for information. Where is it? There it is. All right, so if you actually look at this map of railroads and their construction areas, you see all these little black dots in these circles, right? The colored circles actually indicate major hubs, and also the other colored circles indicate major deposits of coal and iron. And if you actually notice the black dots inside of them, those are large cities that were built right inside of all the coal and iron deposits, and then railroads were used to connect all of them together. You've got major cities that are going to pop up. Ones like Manchester, Birmingham, which is a very, very big city, especially in the Industrial Revolution because it's on the western coast towards Wales. Or not the coast, but it's on the western side of the island towards Wales. And one of the other big ones, though, is Manchester, right? Manchester becomes a very, very popular city during the Industrial Revolution because it's very close to iron deposits, and then also because it becomes a major industrial hub, right? And also the great thing about railroads is they can move people quicker, right? You have people moving into the cities because they have faster ways of transportation, right? Now, the George Stephenson's The Rocket is not going to be automated into a full-blown locomotive kind of style thing until like the 1840s, where it's now going to be more about transportation and less about product creation. We're going to talk about that when we actually talk about the changing of urban life around the 1870s, right? Okay? Just remember that, around the 1870s. Now, anyway, and this thing right here that is pictured directly in front of you is known as the Crystal Palace, right? The Crystal Palace right there, which was constructed a very, very important year that I can't remember. The Crystal Palace was constructed, I believe, in the early 1800s, the Crystal Palace. Now, and it is a building, basically, made completely of iron and glass, right? And it was known as the Crystal Palace because it was an expo center, right? It also is the current day name of a England soccer club in the Premier League. They're not that good. They're okay. They're not the best, though, okay? So it was a great exhibition hall built in 1851. Now, this right here is to show you the seminal creation of the industrial society in England, but also the growing one in Europe, right? Because now the British were like, we're not hiding our industrial secrets. We are showing them off, right? So in the Crystal Palace was an expo center, an exhibition hall, where people used to come and see the latest trends in industry, processing, technology, and other things of the like, right? The very, very first automated of like functioning machines that would be put into factories. Some of the earliest automobiles that were actually like being experimented with. Some of the earliest locomotive models and things like that are all going to be displayed at the Crystal Palace, right? So, and the Crystal Palace does become a very, very big image of how Great Britain kind of became the workshop of the world, right? Now, we're still in the early 1800s, and I was showing you this picture to kind of just use it as a symbol of, right? We're not all the way in 1850, but we're just kind of progressing through things slowly. If you notice in the themes, we were talking about where the Industrial Revolution had its roots in textiles. And then we discussed where the Industrial Revolution has its roots in an energy crisis and how that leads to coal and coal heating and then also steam power, right? And then this leads to da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But the big thing about Britain does become that workshop of the world because they produced 2/3 of the world's coal and half of its iron and cotton by the year 1850, right? So by 1850, they're producing 2/3 of the world's coal, right? And then also, just so you know, very, very important, in 1750, Great Britain was responsible for only 2% of the world output of industrial goods. But by 1860, they were responsible for 20% of the world's industrial output. Like, that is an insane amount and an insane increase. 1 out of 5 chance that if you had an industrial product in your hand, it was made in Great Britain, right? So it's going to make them even furtherly strong, furtherly bigger, like dominance of the seas, as Molly Man Japan's budget after the Battle of Trafalgar, right? And you're going to see an increased dominance in the industrial sector as well, right? And then this is another big one as well, okay? 4 times, what that number represents is the gross national product of Britain, right? The gross national product from 1750 to 1860 quadrupled, right? The GNP, the gross national product, which is the aggregate worth of every product made in Great Britain during a specific year. So by 1850, 4 times the national amount. And then you know what else is crazy? Even their population increased. Their population doubled in 70 years. Now, some of this is due to immigration, not as much as you would think, but also due to the fact that you had the illegitimacy explosion happen on the back end of the 1750s, right? Remember when we talked about the changes in the agricultural revolution, right? How people are getting married later in life, or they're getting illegitimate children, and and like all this other things are happening. That did have a major hand in this, but the Industrial Revolution also provided a setting for larger families and also led to an increased population boom, right? So 21 million people in 70 years. Now, then, write this down. Before you get these, before you write those, write down the sad science, the depressing science, the sad science, okay? The sad science was the name given to the study of economics during the Industrial Revolution. Because as we know, capitalism is going full bore, right? Capitalism is making trains, it's making railroads, it's making coal mines, it's making iron mines, it's making smelting, right? Pig iron is being turned into giant girders that will eventually be used to create suspension bridges and things like that, right? That's the second Industrial Revolution. We'll get to that a little bit later. But it's really important to understand, right? And a thing about it is many economists start becoming known as the sad scientists because it's kind of a gloom and doom science, right? So Thomas Malthus, for example, is going to write a very all-important work called The Essay on the Principle of Population, right? And he said one of the biggest downfalls of the Industrial Revolution is that there are not natural checks anymore on population growth, right? And because that we're producing more goods, what we should be doing is limiting population growth by encouraging people to not have children at a crazy rate, because then we might actually be able to get our industrial output and all of our goods ahead of our population growth. But Thomas Malthus said it is almost inevitable that population will grow at a subsistence level, that we'll never have a surplus of goods to give to the impoverished, that the poverty will stay poor because they're still only getting so much goods because our population continues to increase, right? That's why it's the sad science. He's saying we need things like war and disease to kill some people so we can actually have more goods than necessary, right? God, that's heartbreaking, right? And then David Ricardo, who's another economist, comes up with this idea called the iron law of wages, which he suggests that the growing population is putting pressure on wages and it's preventing true wage growth. Population growth leads to more workers. More workers means we have a greater supply of labor, and the greater the supply, the lower the demand, right? And the price is going to change. So we're saying that because we have too many people now because of the Industrial Revolution, and we don't have Thomas Malthus's ideas limiting their population, we have too many laborers, and with too many laborers, it's keeping wages too low, right? So the sad science of economics, right? So now it's just important to understand that you're seeing scientists kind of just like expand their mind and their horizons. Now, the industrialization, though, of the continent, is this going to spread outside of Great Britain? Of course it is. It should, right? So don't worry about the board thing. I'll kind of show you and explain it a little bit. But the industrialization of the continent is really, really important, right? It's going to spread outside of Great Britain. The Industrial Revolution is going to eventually go further, right? So now it's a slow process, all right? So by the 1850s, the Europeans of the continent themselves had actually began to industrialize, right? But they did not industrialize at the rapid rate that Great Britain did. Some industrialized pretty quickly. Some consider that the United States is one of the biggest ones that actually industrialized around the same pace as Great Britain. But some people argue it's because their economy was separate from the continent itself, right? Now, other places did, though, industrialize relatively quickly. Germany, for example, industrializes relatively quickly. Italy does not, on the other hand, right? If you actually look at those two countries compared to one another, that's a big reason why Germany becomes a superpower going into World War I, because they did industrialize, whereas others, like Italy, were still very agrarian, right? So you're going to see industrialization happen slowly, and it's going to happen at different speeds for different countries, okay? So that's important to understand. Now, also, though, why? Why is that? Why are some countries industrializing a little faster? Why are some countries not industrializing at all? Like if you actually look at some, for example, India, literally their industrialization process apparently went backwards because the British were using them to be agrarian, right? Same thing happened with the Chinese, actually. Their industrialization level went backwards, right? Because they were oppressed by the British as well following the Opium Wars, right? And then if you look at other places, they just grew very stagnantly. But why? What is the thing that's preventing other places from industrializing quite like Great Britain did? Well, one, a lot of it has to do with inflation, right? Because of the era of exploration going all the way back to 1492 with Christopher Columbus and the discovery of new products and new goods and surplus goods, it's going to lead to the inflation of prices, right? With the inflation of prices, it makes it more difficult to get loans or investment opportunities in industrial ideas, right? So also, destruction. Napoleon ruined the continent. We're talking about over 1 million people dead after the Napoleonic Wars. We're talking about entire cities burnt to the ground, i.e. Moscow. We're talking about a lot of different areas that saw destruction during the period of 1795 to 1815. So that's going to slow them down. You have to rebuild before you can industrialize, right? Also, money for investment, okay? So following the advent of steam power, you needed to have the ability to take out a very large investment to invest in a factory or workspace, and then also to invest in the equipment that would be used to power said factory. Now, this is a very large amount of money. You have to be able to put down payments on these things. You have to be able to get limited liability loans that weren't quite around yet, right? And so that money for investment was hard to come by on the continent, whereas in Great Britain, it was in plentiful excess, right? That money was there because they dominated the Atlantic Ocean. They dominated the entire trade that was going on over the Atlantic Ocean. They also dominated naval supremacy. So they had money and goods coming from their East India Company, so there was money in pockets and it was there and available. Now, some of y'all would argue, be like, well, what about the inflation rates? The money was held in the pockets of a small elite, right? The upper class elite and the upper middle class elite were the ones that had all the money. It was not pilfered throughout everyone, which is going to be a big problem, of course, as we know for Spain in the 1600s, right? So also revolution. As we know, the French Revolution lasted for a very long period of time, and that's going to lead to a slow industrial process. Also, secrets don't make friends, right? So sometimes I'll be like looking around, I'll see Marie Rowley and Mary Salvaggio looking back at each other, secrets don't make friends, all right? So because I bring that up, Great Britain kept the Industrial Revolution to themselves. For a long period of time, going up until about the 1815, 1810s era, it was very explicitly stated by the British government that British scientists that have discovered things like James Watt, Thomas Savery, John Newcomen, these guys that did the steam engines would keep these secrets to themselves, or they would only sell these ideas to British patent offices who would then sell them to British companies, right? So for a very long period of time, Britain was secretive, and they kept their industrialism to themselves. War is going to be a big reason, and then also, of course, going back to destruction, we got Napoleon related to that one as well. Now, 1815 kind of serves as the starting line. Thank God for the putting out system and leftover guilds, and also you can borrow money for Britain. Now, the reason why I say thank God for the putting out system is because the continent kept the putting out system way longer than the British did. And when they do this, it's going to lead to an impetus to replace it, and it's also going to leave a very large workforce available, right? And the leftover guilds were going to also provide a very large specialized workforce, right? So they had the labor to actually begin the industrialization of the continent. And also, Britain's got so much money, we can just start borrowing from who? Let's borrow from Great Britain, right? So now, what are these agents of industrialization, right? What I have up here is AI, is not artificial intelligence. It's the agents of industrialization. What is going to be the elemental things that actually make industrialization possible in the continent, okay? So maybe you should put in the continent right here. So the agents of industrialization in the continent. Well, a big part of it is that British technology and British laborers are going to start secretly selling secrets. They're going to start selling these secrets of steam engines and things like that to other European countries. So there are going to be some underhanded tactics that do include the spreading of industrial technology through illicit means to members of the continent. Mainly because they're willing to pay a lot for these secrets because they want to know how the heck to make their own steam engines, how to make their own pig iron, how to make their own steam hammers, how to make their own industrialization processes so they can stop paying premiums for it from Great Britain, right? Also, cultural diffusion, right? You have to understand, through trade, there is just going to be the spread of cultural traits. These inventions and industrialization is going to begin to spread. Now, the biggest one out of all of them, though, as you can see, I have 2 stars there beside it, is going to be government support, okay? The governments of Europe, post-French Revolution, new German Confederation, the Prussian Empire, not so much the Austrians. They literally were refusing industrialization for a very long period of time. But especially the Dutch and then also the French post-revolution were very all about industrializing as fast as possible, right? They were like, we need to keep up with Britain and we need to industrialize so we can stay on this level of technological development, right? So a big part of that, how you're going to protect your slow infant, look at this little industrial revolution that's happening in France and Germany, right? How do you keep them protected? How do you keep this little baby industrial revolution protected? Well, one of the big ones is you start slapping tariffs on products, right? How do you make your goods cheaper than foreign goods? You smack tariffs on foreign goods, right? A tariff is a tax on an imported good, right? So what's going to end up happening is the French government, the German government, well, the Prussian government at the time, leading up to the German government in 1871, is going to start smacking tariffs on British products, right? If you want to buy this product from Great Britain, it's going to cost you more money. If you want to buy this good from us, it's going to actually be more cost effective for you, and you just bought a French good to support the French industrialization process, right? Also, railroads were laid by governments, not by private ownership or by private entrepreneurs, right? In Great Britain, contracting firms laid the railroads to support these cities and also to get to these coal companies and these iron companies, right? Whereas railroads in France and in Prussia and in Central Europe around Switzerland and other areas like that, those are going to be laid by governments. The governments are going to actually come in, step in, and begin to do subsidies for companies and actually begin to pay directly for railroads to be built, right? Also, industry became tied together with national pride, right? Nationalism is on the rise. So the industrialization of your country became a very, very, very important component of that. And then also another really big one, corporate banks and limited liability protection, right? As normalcy returns to the continent following the era of Napoleon, corporate banking starts in its infancy as well, okay? And they begin to issue these things known as limited liability loans, where you only stand to lose the amount that you originally invested. So they make it easier to take out loans, right? This is a very, very big thing when it comes to the industrialization of the continent, okay? But the biggest thing you need to know going into the AP test and going into this entire thing is that the continent industrialized slower. It industrialized slower than Great Britain because it came in after, and a lot of it has to do with a bunch of the reasons why it did take longer, right? Because Napoleon, destruction, inflation, what else? War, revolutions, things like that were preventing it from actually industrializing as quickly as everybody else, right? But you're also going to see massive societal impacts, though. So as the Industrial Revolution goes forward and as it spreads to the continent and as it continues to progress, why am I saying as this many times? But still, it's going to have massive societal impacts. And one of the biggest ones is it's going to change the hierarchy of society completely. And it's going to give you not brand new classes. It's going to add one brand new class, and it's going to grow a certain other one. So we talked about this in class, right? We're going to see the growth of the middle class. But the one you got to start with is up here at the top of this triangle. You got the upper class. This is the old nobility, right? This is what's left over of them. This is the old money. This is the money that has existed in the hands and the bank accounts of dukes and duchesses for several hundred years, right? So that's your upper class, your old money. So then you've got The middle class, the industrial middle class. You're going to see huge growth of the industrial middle class. The middle class did exist leading up to the Industrial Revolution, but it was very, very small, right? So we talked about this numerous times. The bourgeois in France, the middle class in Great Britain and their enclosure movements and things like that, right? So you're going to see huge growth in the middle class because they're going to start turning themselves into factory owners, professionals. They're going to pay for their education. They're going to split themselves into multiple layers as well. You're going to have an upper class, a middle class, and a lower middle class, right? So that's why I have this break so large, right? Now, also, you can tell that the old upper class is very, very tiny. Some people sometimes refer to the old upper class as blue bloods, right, as it being old money from hundreds of years, right? And then the last one you have is the industrial working class, right? Those are your factory workers, those are your laborers, etc., which are also going to be split into multiple layers. You're going to have your your industrial working class on the upper echelon. You're going to have your lower industrial working class, depending on what job they hold or what they do for a living, right? Now, the big thing about this is how is this going to affect the big play out of European history? Well, one of the biggest and most important things is, which is very different from the feudal era. In the feudal era, you weren't so conscious of where you were in this structure. But now the Industrial Revolution has created this upper, middle, lower. You're aware of it. You know where you are, right? You know you're a part of the working class, or you know you're a part of the middle class, or you know you're a part of that upper class, which leads to this concept of class consciousness, right? You know where you are. You're aware that other people have more or less than you, and you think that they didn't do enough, or why can't I be here, right? So you start to become very aware of it. And how is this going to play about? Well, this term was coined by none other than this guy, right? This dude's name is Karl Marx, right? So, and he is, of course, going to be the writer and creator of the Communist Manifesto, right? Now, Friedrich Engels, which is Karl Marx's partner, he's going to write diatribes with Karl Marx on the conditions of the working class, okay? Now, a lot of historians argue the reason why working class diatribes were not written before the Industrial Revolution is because the industrial middle class is now more visible, right? The serfs were not visible. You could not see them. You had to go to a lord's manor and go to his land to see what the poorer classes looked like, right? But now the fact that the industrial class is aware of its own existence, and then also it's in your face because it exists in cities and we're having massive urbanization movements, there's more to talk about. There's more to write about. And you can see labor subjugation in your everyday life. So the seeds of communism were planted during the Industrial Revolution in its earliest phases. Now, the Communist Manifesto is not going to be written until 1848, and it doesn't even become popular until 1888. So we still are a ways out from understanding the massive impact of the communist era, right? The communist era is not going to become fully adult until like the early 1900s, especially when we're getting up to the lead up of the communist revolution in Russia, which is where we will actually read the manifesto so we can understand the principles that Lenin is actually doing his ranting and raving about, right? Now, going forward, though, we are then going to spend some time to discuss the middle class, right? The industrial middle class and these other people, right? So just to give you a heads up, we're going to stop right about here, okay? So what we're going to do in class is we're going to start talking about the industrial middle class, and then we're going to start talking about the industrial working class and kind of where they started, where they came from, and how these classes have changed the game, right? Now, biggest and most important thing is the industrial middle class was born out of competition, right? A big element of competition and competitive value goes hand in hand with capitalism, right? Competition, the invisible hand that Adam Smith always discussed, makes products better and pushes people to make more money, okay? But the thing about it is the competitive field is beginning to narrow, okay? Because early factory owners struggled to send their kids to school because the young middle class at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s were highly, highly, highly small. But since they had the ability to send their children to school, that kept their businesses afloat, okay? Now, eventually, when the children inherit them. So your earliest factory owners, let's say I'm an early factory owner in the early industrial middle class in the late 1700s. I'm doing my best to keep my fledgling factory going. It's got spinning jennies, maybe some water frames inside of it, and I'm still next to a river, right? I'm going to struggle to send my child to school, but once I do, and he has now gotten older and he has become educated, he might have become educated on some of the most modern inventions, right? Steam power might be something he actually does. And so the big thing is that's going to change and drift and convert into a stronger industrial middle class as the Industrial Revolution continues to go. But I'm going to leave you there. Y'all have a great weekend. I'll see y'all soon.